Hi, how are you? Welcome to our second lesson today. Today, we shall actually cover two main objectives. That is, we shall discuss about some growth patterns, and then we shall go ahead and talk about some growth curves. So, let us first of all demystify or talk about patterns of growth in living organisms. Now, living organisms show four main types or patterns of growth, but we shall actually group them into two main pairs because the two pairs are contradicting. For example, the first pair is allometric and isometric growth. Allometric and isometric growth pattern. So how is allometric and isometric growth pattern? How do they differ from one another? Or what is allometric growth pattern and what is isometric growth pattern? Iso is not very fast actually time to hear that particular prefix. Like if you in primary school you learned about a triangle with all the three sides being equal. What do you call that particular triangle? Isosceles triangle. So iso means equal, whereas allo means unequal. So allometric growth is a type of growth where the rate of growth of various parts of the body is unequal. As in, as the whole organism is growing, the other parts of the body do not grow in equal rate. This one, for example, in humans, legs, hands, maybe ears do not grow at the same rate. Okay, ears do not grow at the same rate as legs. Otherwise, if they could grow at the same rate, then humans could be having very long ears. Okay, so allometric growth rate refers, or growth pattern, refers to the unequal growth rate in different parts of the body, or it is whereby there is an equal growth rate of different parts of the body in comparison to the growth rate of the whole body. On the other hand, isometric growth rate or growth pattern refers to the unequal iso means equal, refers to the equal growth rate of body parts in comparison to the growth of the body as a whole. So if you have an organism with all the organs growing at the same rate, that is what we call isometric growth. On the other hand, if some parts of the body grow at a faster rate than others, that one is allometric growth pattern. Is it clear? Then we have limited and unlimited growth. The word limited, what is the meaning? So limited growth pattern actually is a type of growth pattern whereby organisms stop growing after a particular age. Most cases, vertebrates, most mammals, most birds, okay, they grow up to a certain age and then they stop growing. That is limited growth because growth doesn't occur throughout their lives. Whereas unlimited growth is where organisms grow throughout their lives. This means that they do not actually stop growing at some age. Some plants or most plants have got unlimited growth. We also have some reptiles like some snakes. They grow throughout their lives. That is what we call unlimited growth. Whereas limited growth is whereby organisms stop growing after a particular age. Is it clear? Good. Now, at this particular time, let us start talking about the different types of growth curves. So suppose you consider one parameter. We have learned about parameters that we can use to measure growth. For example, how do you know that maybe calf is growing? Calf, the young ones of a cattle, is growing. You can decide to measure what? Its body weight every day or maybe every month, and then you record. So in the first month, you'll be able to record some data. You'll be able to see that as the time goes by, its mass increases. Okay, so when you plot that change in mass over time, you'll actually come up with a graph. That graph is called growth curve. Is it clear? Therefore, a growth curve is a graph obtained when measurement of growth is plotted against time. When you plot measurement of growth against time, we shall actually obtain what we call the growth curve. Now, we have two main types of growth curves. Can you guess? Yes. So we have only two main types of growth curves. The first one is what we call the sigmoid curve. This is mostly called the normal growth curve, but in biology we call it the sigmoid curve. Okay, and the second curve is what we call the intermittent growth curve. The intermittent growth curve. Now let us now go to the first example we have given about a calf, maybe from birth, that is age 0 up, let's say 3 years. If maybe we plot, we measure its weight after every month, we should be able to see that the mass increases. Is it clear? And then if we plot the change in mass, against time, we shall be able to see that at the beginning, maybe in the first 3 months, there will be very little mass. Okay, and then the mass will increase rapidly at a point whereby there will be no more increase in mass. So the shape of this graph, as you can see, is S-shaped. This type of graph that we shall obtain if we plot growth against time, we call it sigmoid curve. And the second curve, which we shall discuss later, is what we call the intermittent curve. So let us begin with the sigmoid curve. So sigmoid curve is obtained in many organisms when the measurement of growth in an organism is plotted against time. It is usually S-shaped, as we shall see later. And this pattern is due to the fact that growth tends to be slow at the beginning, and then speed up rapidly, and then finally slows down as adult size is reached. Like if maybe we were to compare how you grew between age, maybe let's say 0 years up to 5 years, then from 5 years to 10 years, then from 10 years to 15 years, then 15 years to 20 years, 20 years to 25 years. You'll be able to see that at the beginning, the increase in mass was very little. But at around age 10, there was a very rapid increase in mass. And by the time now you are 20 years, you'll have reached your maturity. Then the mass will tend to slow down, or the height, for that case, will tend to remain stationary. Why? We have to actually study this particular sigmoid curve. Let us look at this particular diagram here. So if we plot growth, like maybe length, height, mass etc against time, we shall be able to come up with this particular type of curve. And this curve is what we call the sigmoid curve. The sigmoid curve has got how many faces? Can you able to see there? Or how many regions? They are labeled with letters. We have region A, B, C, and D. In region A, as you can see here, there is actually slow growth rate. The growth rate is very slow. Why do you think the reason as to why growth rate at region A is slow? What is the name of this particular phase? You'll answer it. B, what happens to B? There is a rapid growth rate. You are able to see here that there is a rapid increase in growth at that particular time. Why? So you think about it. What about C? At C, there is a slower growth rate. And then at D, actually the growth has stopped. In some cases, even it will start dropping again. But in most cases, it remains flat like that. Is it clear? Now, what is the name given to these particular phases of the sigmoid curve? Zone A, we call it the lag phase. Lag phase, L-A-G. Okay? Zone B, we call it log phase or exponential phase. C, we call it decelerating phase. Whereas D is plateau or stationary phase. Let us have this particular diagram. This is another diagram of the sigmoid curve. Now, in this particular case, we shall have to discuss what happens in these particular regions. So, the first region A is this one here, which we have said it is called the lag phase. Lag phase. So, this is the lag phase here, which corresponds to region A. So why do you think that there is a slower growth rate? So this actually is because eventually maybe it is from time when it is 0 onwards, the earlier time. This is because the cells are yet to adapt. Or if maybe it is an organism placed in a new ecosystem, the organism is yet to adapt to the environment. Okay? Number 2, there is also fewer cells that are dividing. And if you're dealing with organisms, we shall say maybe the reproducing organisms are also fewer. That's why there is a slower growth rate. Okay? Now we want to go to part B. Part B is the log phase, also known as exponential phase. So in phase B, there is a faster growth rate. You can see that the number of organisms is actually increasing rapidly. Why? One or some of the reasons are: 1, the organisms have adapted to the environment. Number 2, there is actually no competition for nutrients, for space, for mates. Okay? Number 3, birth rate is higher than death rate. That's why the population is increasing rapidly. Then we have phase C. Phase C, this one here, we call it decelerating phase. Decelerating phase. Here, there is a diminishing growth, meaning that the growth occurs now, it starts slowing down. And this here is because of the following reasons. 1, competition has started to occur. The organisms are competing for some resources which are now scarce. Okay. Number 2, the nutrients are diminishing. Okay. Number 3, there might be accumulation of some toxic waste. Some toxic waste materials are accumulating, hence making some of the organisms to die. This makes growth rate to decrease. And finally, the organisms are actually aged. They have actually grown old at this particular phase, what we call the diminishing growth phase or the decelerating phase. Hence, growth rate occurs at a slower rate. Finally, we have phase D, which is the stationary phase or the plateau phase. Plateau phase. At that particular point, you're able to see that there is actually no net increase in growth. Meaning that if you're dealing with individual organisms, the number of death rate and birth rate is equal. The death rate and birth rate is equal. This means the number of organisms that are dying equals the number of organisms that are being born. Hence, there is no net increase in population size. Is it clear? So that is how you can explain the sigmoid curve. So I've said position A, we call it lag phase. Lag. Sometimes we're told stop lagging behind. Meaning here that stop slowing behind. So lag phase actually is characterized by slow growth rate. Then we have exponential phase or log phase. Here is whereby the growth rate occurs very fast. Then we have part C, decelerating phase. And then part D, we have the stationary phase or what we call plateau phase. Let us have the text. So I've said that we have the following phases. 1, a lag phase. So here I've said there is slow growth rate. And this is because of the following factors. Ya kwanza, organisms are adapting to the environment. The organisms are still adapting to the environment. Number 2, the number of cells dividing are few. The number of cells dividing are few. But if you're dealing with maybe organisms, you will say that the number of organisms maybe are still few. Okay. Number 2, or phase B, we have exponential phase. Here we have seen that in exponential phase, the rate of growth proceeds exponentially, proceeds very fast. There is a very rapid growth rate. And this rapid growth rate is due to the following. 1, organisms have already adapted to the environment. Number 2, the first growth rate is due to the birth rate being higher than death rate. The number of organisms being born is higher than the number of organisms dying. Okay. Number 3, the number of cells which are dividing has increased. Okay. Food and other factors are not limiting. There is sufficient food, sufficient light for the plants, sufficient oxygen, sufficient carbon dioxide. So all these factors are not limited. Hence, there is no competition. Then the third phase is what we call decelerating phase, diminishing phase, decelerating phase. Now, the decelerating phase, so in this phase, growth becomes limited. There is a slower growth rate due to some of the following factors. This one here are most cells have differentiated. Or if we're talking about living organisms, most of them are aged now. Okay. Number 3, fewer cells are still developing. Okay. Then there might be some shortage of nutrients and oxygen, hence growth is decreasing. Then cells are competing for scarce resources. Competition must have set in. If you're dealing with organisms, you'll also say that organisms are competing for nutrients, which is scarce. Space may also be limited if we're dealing with cells, and there is also accumulation of toxic metabolic waste, and this will prevent growth. Lastly, if you are dealing with the plants, because of high increase in population, there might be limited acquisition of carbon dioxide and light in green plants. This will lead to diminishing growth. Lastly, we have the plateau phase. Plateau phase. Plateau is the last part whereby you have the graph actually remaining stationary. Okay, so the graph remains stationary because the birth rate and death rate are equal. The birth rate and death rate are equal. Okay, therefore there is no increase in population. Hence, if you're dealing with, let's say, number of organisms, they will remain stationary. Why is it that the number of organisms remain stationary there? This is because of the following. 1, nutrients are depleted. Number 2, there is accumulation of toxic waste. Number 3, there is lack of space. Number 4, some individuals are old, hence are not capable of reproducing. Is it clear? And death rate equals to birth rate. Sawa. Okay, so these are the reasons as to why at plateau there is actually no net increase in growth. Is it clear? Now, it's important to note the following, that under ideal conditions, some organisms may not show this phase. This phase, which is the plateau phase. In some cases, some organisms may continue to grow throughout their lives, as in they do not actually reach plateau. Okay, so the nature of this curve at this phase, that is the plateau phase, depends on the nature of the parameter and also the species of organisms that is being studied. For example, in monocotyledonous plants, many invertebrates, fish, and certain reptiles, this curve may continue slightly. In some, the curve may flatten, while in others it may even tail off. It may actually flatten and then tail off. Let me illustrate here. I'm saying it may, if this is the sigmoid curve, if this is a sigmoid curve and this is the plateau phase, so in some it may tail off. This shows that maybe the parameter in consideration is decreasing. For example, if you compare height of human beings, there is a certain point whereby the aged human being tends to degenerate, as in the height decreases, especially when the man or the woman, the old man or woman, is walking while bending. So if you were to measure the height, you'll be able to see that it's high. The height of that particular person will have decreased. So if you measure that particular height at that particular point, you'll be able to see him, or you'll be able to see that it has tailed off, meaning that it has decreased. This actually is a sign of negative growth rate, and this one is very evident in many mammals, and it is usually associated to aging. Sawa. Now, sigmoid curve is not applicable to all living organisms. Some organisms, like arthropods, growth may not occur throughout their lives, but growth may occur at some intervals. And such organisms now will not be able to show a sigmoid curve, but instead they'll show an intermittent curve. Therefore, in the next section, we shall discuss about the intermittent curve. Any question? Good. Therefore, I want to ask you some few questions. Question 1. Can you give the patterns of growth? We have said allometric, isometric, limited, and unlimited. Good. Are you able to define them? What is isometric growth? Isometric growth is a type of growth whereby various parts of organisms grow at the same rate. What about allometric? A type of growth whereby different parts grow at different rates. Then we have said that we have two main types of growth curves. Can you name them? Yes, so we have said we have the sigmoid curve and the intermittent curve. Okay. Can you name the various phases of the sigmoid curve? Sigmoid curve, we've said we have the lag phase, the exponential phase, the decelerating phase, and the plateau phase. So with those few remarks, we shall stop there for this particular section. In our next discussion, we shall discuss about the intermittent curve. Otherwise, have a nice time. See you later. Bye.